but I want Bumble in a car right there when a woman makes the first move on the grid, and put Bumble on the car.
Welcome to Brand Formula, a new podcast focused on the marketing and brands at play in Formula One today. Your hosts are myself, I'm Mordecai, and my co-host is Elyssa Margulis. Between us, we have 30 years of marketing experience across agencies, in-house at brands, digital platforms, content studios, and more. We're also big F1 fans. Elyssa was raised on F1 from childhood, and I am a Drive to Survive COVID convert. Each week, we will bring to you our takes on F1's marketing paddock and beyond. We'll analyze the advertising and marketing moves being made, the audience as it continues to evolve across markets, and look at white spaces we think need to be covered. Who is seeing an ROI and who's DNF'd? Thank you for listening, and please support us by following wherever you follow. We are at brandformulapod, and subscribe wherever you are listening. Now, let's talk the brand formulas shaping F1 today. On to the episode.
Welcome to Brand Formula. It is episode 7, and Viva la France! Doriane Pin drove an F1 car today. We are recording this on Saturday, the 18th of April, and Mercedes posted this early this morning, but we brought it up last week. It's been 3 years. What a nice way to start the day.
It was so lovely to wake up to that. And I have to say, the video message that Susie Wolff left Dorian before she got in that car was a masterclass in mentorship and leadership. And I would encourage anyone who is a leader or a mom or anyone that interacts with other human beings to go and watch that video, because she used her own personal experience to inspire Dorian, but she really told her to make it her own and leave her own mark and not follow in someone else's footsteps. And it got me a little emotional, because I think that kind of mentorship is oftentimes missing on our social media feeds.
Oh, I mean, what a great example. I have been generally saying, and someone this week was just having a lot of verbose conversations around certain sort of typical leaders in our marketing industry, and we're not a gossip podcast, so I'm not going to digress. But when that happened, I said, the way that I sort of delineate that now is I say, that's great. Who have they brought up with them?
Yep. My favorite thing, the way that we think about mentorship. Hire people you that will one day take your job, because you will learn far more from them and you will have a mutual mentorship relationship with them.
And we see it, and we talked about it with Total Wolff and James Vowles and Susie, which we haven't talked a lot about Susie on the pod, but that is what you see, and you can answer that question for all three of them. Who have they brought up? And I think we over focus on leaders that sound good or have great sound bites, but to me that is the definition of great leadership. And what a wonderful occasion today was to know that journey. The last time a woman drove an F1 car was today.
Mm-hmm. Love it.
Excellent. Other than that, it was a little quiet this week. We had some long form interviews from Stefano Domenicali and things like that. But really, it was a quiet week. And I always think with most of the world, when it's quiet, get ready. We're probably going to get all of the announcements of all of the regulation changes and so on. But
I think next week.
I think you're completely correct as we run up to things. So for episode 7, we wanted to go into the lore of F1 a little bit and talk about the history of sponsorships, sort of how F1 sort of carved itself out and, the early days of what it was. Because, we were talking about the FIA last week and this incongruous versus congruous storytelling to lead them towards brand transparency. And they really started being vehicles for brands to have conversations. That was the initial part of this. And so diving into the lore today, I always think, if you aren't familiar with F1 at all, or basically the genesis of popular culture as it goes, you may be like, are you kidding me? A sport had a cigarette sponsor? but of course they all did. They had cigarette areas, and all people were smoking in the baseball grandstands when I was going to Shea Stadium. These are all things that existed. But the first sponsor for F1 was Gold Leaf Tobacco. And that was the beginning of the cigarettes and cars era. It's a contradiction, but it's the lens we're going to look at today. So as we look for that, as we say in our opening, you are the lifelonger. So let's go back to the late 60s and let's talk about Formula One. It did start a little bit earlier, but this is when we started getting the monetization of Formula One.
We really did. And I think the visual identity of that time is so ubiquitous in Formula One. And a lot of current fans, but also long-term fans, that's the era that you kind of think about when you think about F1 really being such a part of pop culture and of marketing, of advertising. But really before the 60s, it was about motorsport. It was racing. You did not see logos on those cars. It was not about sponsorship. It was about a love of fast things and highly, highly dangerous things. But the F1 needed to make money. And so they opened the doors to sponsors and tobacco companies. I always think back, like, were they all picking up the phone and calling the FIA and all of these teams on the same day when this news broke? It must have been, because within a few years, it was just tobacco companies everywhere. And there was a real shift that was kind of happening at this time. It was like the Mad Men era of cigarette marketing. And all of those ads were just so iconic, but government regulations were really changing. And so where cigarettes could show up was in its first shift, really, at that time in the 60s. And so they needed a new way to get customers. And F1, in a way, wasn't necessarily chosen because it was the right vehicle. And I had to say that. But because a lot of other things were being closed off to tobacco brands. And so F1 was there, and F1 said, we will take your money. And there was a huge value in being associated with it. It was thrill, it was glamour, it was global. And I think 1973 was really a turning point, because that's when Marlboro partnered with Ferrari. And by 1984, the main livery literally looked like a Marlboro red pack. Yes, they shared a color, so there was an inherent visual identity that made sense, but it was really, I think, one of the first times that you were just seeing a car covered in a brand logo. And I love that Duracell kind of got a bit of inspiration from this for, making the car look like a battery. But anyway, back to Marlboro. In 1997, they became the team's title sponsor, and Schumacher was driving at this time. He was winning races and championships, and he was plastered in Marlboro. His suit, literally, Marlboro across the front. The car, Marlboro. The merch that was coming out at that time was big, in a way, bigger than F1. And people were wearing Marlboro, not necessarily because they were huge F1 fans, because there was just this cachet around what that merch represented, the lifestyle that it represented. And I think it's kind of fascinating, because there's obviously a huge Gen Z recurrence, reimagination of the 2000s. And so now that merch is selling for like hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on vintage sites. But it was really more than a sponsorship. It kind of became brand identity, and it lasted so many more decades, even after that investment really stopped or changed, which we'll get into in a second. And it did seem like a bit of a contradiction that you had one of the highest performing sports in the world, and yet there was smoking associated. But it was kind of a different time, and we weren't biohacking, we weren't like sober curious, we weren't getting our 10,000 steps a day. Like, it was a lifestyle that you felt like if you smoked, you were a part of. And that was really interesting. And at that time, you kind of saw Marlboro Cowboys and Marlboro F1 Playboys. Those were the two real big archetypes. And we'll talk a little bit about female-focused brands getting into F1. But I think what was kind of fascinating, and it shows you where that time was, is that they really were obviously marketing to men, but their marketing crossed so much because they played very much into, these boys that all the women wanted to be around.
Yeah, definitely. There's, two things in particular that I think are interesting, and it's that merch first in terms of motorsports, that you'll see way more people that have the leather jacket than even have the faintest idea of where Ferrari is based, even, like that's the level of ignorance. And that, by the way, fashion is fashion, style is style, you do you. One of the phrases I've heard is that era was about, basically, this is what some of the history books say, it was basically about, well, yes, there's a slow death, but you could have a high reward, high risk life on your journey there. And it was like, that's the story that we're going to be telling as we go through this process. And, we want to talk a little bit about these brand formulas that put things together for our F1 fans out there. Our marketers know, there's a standard 5 pillars for brand strategy. As more on the innovation side, I like to mess with those at all times. This is where I always need to shout out Larry Vincent, who wrote the book Brand Real. I worked with him once and talk about a leader that lifts people up and brings people along with him. But I was breaking classic pillars left and right, and he teaches brand strategy at USC in Los Angeles. He's a key figure of business administration degrees and marketing. We like to play in that. But the bottom line is there's basically the 5 Ps. And your 5 Ps are your purpose, why the brand exists, your positioning, where it sits in market, the personality, that voice and tone, perception, so how the audience is viewing it, and then promotion, which is the comms. And we're talking about marketing, so people really like to play with the words there. So if you don't like the 5 Ps, you go on with yourself. But when it gets to Marlboro, exactly what Elyssa's saying, we had that cowboy spirit and aligned that with that Ferrari era. They were the premium position. F1 is a bit of a premium sport still at that time, because the bottom line is you're building that car, and the personality was like stoic, heroic, and authoritative, while F1 was serious, clinical, and corporate. So you're getting that rub that's happening. And then that perception, though, of, which is odd, but for Marlboro, it was very much like success and reliability. Like anytime you crack a pack of Marlboro Reds, you're going to kind of have that same great feeling. But that's an interesting sort of perception to have. And then also they aligned to that official color side in terms of what was happening in F1, and brought that Marlboro world that you're talking about to the masses with it. And it's because what we see overall is that these brands were telling the story of Formula One for people, because those jackets walking around on people are telling the story of Formula One for people to start to understand. While jumping now, we've talked about the Drive to Survive journey, and we have something in between there as well, but you're really seeing that change. We talked about now there's this AI story, this cash versus compute. Is this the new sponsor story that's being told as they continue to go forward? What are we looking at? And if we look at, for instance, like when Red Bull came in and took over in 95 from these cigarette companies, then you suddenly had an energy drink, and that was younger. So all of those old guys with their energy drink, I think the only commonality was that there were still grid girls.
Very good point.
Grid girls did not change. Grid girls changed outfits, but they survived the cigarette era, and they survived the energy drink era.
They did. I mean, they were only gone in the influencer era and post Me Too. So that is probably, everyone should go on a deep dive of what grid girls were, the history of them, and what happened. And we could probably do a whole episode about, are the influencers the new grid girls? But that's, again, story for another day.
Yes. Absolutely. Story for another day. But it was an interesting sort of era of time that we saw there. So how that Marlboro era was. And there was also Imperial Tobacco on the grid. There was Camel on the grid. And you just saw these brands kind of going and carving out their lanes, using their the P's to move to that, what was it going to be? For Imperial, they're looking at their positioning to be a little bit more high-end luxury. They're looking at themselves as being mysterious, sleek, and minimalist, and kind of playing with the avant-gardeness that's always, because it's a bit of that rebel spirit. And then, you go into the Camel side and it's all playful, rebel. And so all of this was really narrating in the fashion, like you mentioned, but on the grid, how things were. Like, there are these cigarette boxes basically, or cigarettes running all around and going faster. And it's just more and more conversation for these brands that, in essence, would contradict most of the moves of the drivers today.
Yeah, it was a very different time when I think we're talking about brand strategy versus brand identity versus brand performance. You have to look at the past in a different way that you're looking at the now, because there was no algorithm, there was no performance marketing, there was no click through. So it was really about reach and association and repetition. You had to be super clear on what your brand stood for, especially when there were so many brands within the same category. And so I love that each of them, 30, 40 years later, we can be super clear about what they owned. And to me, that is, well, we're not going to repeat brands putting cigarettes. We'll get into what the new cigarettes are. We will put it. Well, that is happening. But I really love that it kind of gave us this brilliant peek into brand strategy. And if you watch Mad Men, another space to kind of see what it looked like to sit around these tables at this time and to really, really focus on how do you identify what a brand means and what a brand wants to say. And that worked really well for Marlboro, because even when tobacco was banned from F1, Philip Morris invented a fake brand called Mission Winnow so they could stay on the Ferrari. I cannot get over this. Their relationship lasted 50 years through tobacco being banned from the sport. Now, it was a shell company. And to be clear, it was only disbanded 4 years ago in 2022, which I don't know. I can't wrap my head around it. I just think it's absolutely insane and slightly unethical. But that is so fascinating because they wanted to stay on the car, but they created a brand that had no brand identity, didn't really have a reason to exist. And so do you see people walking around with Mission Winnow merch? You do not. It is really important to think about, what does legacy mean? What does brand building mean? How are you measuring what that is when you are investing so much money into a sponsorship, a partnership, a talent? That really does bring us to those P's of today, and doing that really important work to identify what that's going to look like. Legacy is so key, and it's not necessarily something that you can just buy into. So
I mean, I would personally I feel like that's like a cult object that someone's going to reinvent the Mission Winnow merch and just start putting it out there. But, I've seen opening ceremony do versions of dive bar shirts from bars I used to go to and things like that. But, they will do their thing. But what's always so interesting in this space is that also, as we're talking about these groups of sponsors, so these categories coming to the grid, always in mass, like the hotel jump, now each of them, there's a Marriott and a Hilton now. But the journey of that in terms of what was available to these brands for that sponsorship has significantly evolved, obviously because of the advent of media, which continues to change, shift and change. But when we're talking about these early points, no one's seeing what the driver's really wearing as much as we do now. The car is going fast, not as fast, but is going fast, and it's not no one's really seeing the logos on the car. But what's going on around the track and what the tracks are named and where the tracks are, which we'll get into at a different episode. But all of that is really changing that narrative of what people are going for. So you get this ability to say, look, we're here, and then tell a different kind of story off the grid. And everyone had these different opportunities. And there were brands that were trying to sort of disrupt that space and create a legacy of their own in it, which has always been interesting, whether they did it successfully or not.
I love that you're talking about needing to tell this story in these different spaces, because we talk a lot about world building and how brands need to know who they are, know who they are for, know what problems they are solving, but then they need to build worlds around those stories. And those stories cannot be the same in every medium. And I love thinking about the Benetton era of F1, because to me, that was kind of your first space that I personally think was about world building. They came in such a unique way because they were just a sponsor, and they were sponsoring an F1 team, and they were very much like you were saying about what people were wearing and this lifestyle that was happening off the track. And they used F1 as a mechanism to tell this broader story. And they saw that they were getting a lot of new customers, new interest, new brand awareness through this. They were very global at the time, and they needed to really be cementing themselves in the US. And they saw F1 as a way to do that. So they actually purchased their own team in 1985. They kind of laid the groundwork for what Red Bull is today in a way. They really made their drivers extensions of their brand identity. They made that car an extension of their brand's identity. And it worked. And I was in elementary school when they made this investment. And I will say, I begged my mom to buy me Benetton. I thought the images that were coming from Formula One with Benetton, the ads that they were creating with their drivers and the people around F1 made me want to be a part of it. And that was their goal. Probably not to have like 6-year-olds, but it worked. And they were really becoming a global brand with a unique way to tell their story in and around all of these different mechanisms. They used experiential, they used their advertising, they used the storytelling from the drivers, they used media in a really interesting way. So I always love that case study. I'll always stand by it. And maybe I'm going to go search some vintage Benetton merch after this.
Oh my goodness. I got bullied one time because I had fake Benetton on.
Oh my gosh, that's like my fake Keds. I wanted Keds so bad. And I got the Kmart version of Keds, and they made that really horrible noise when you walk down the school hallways. Like you knew that it
Yeah.
was like a fake rubber bottom. And yeah,
Yeah, I
never
wanted to
forget
fit
that.
in, and I think it was probably found at Marshall's or something, and it was like the rugby shirt, and it said Benetton on it, but you could see the color
It was
clash
just a
of
little off.
yeah, it was just a little off, and I didn't know because I didn't have the brand book of Benetton at that age. I was just like, let me fit in, and boom, teased right
So
out of the
that's a
hallways
little
on
bit of
that
our
one.
lore.
That's a little bit of our lore. But I also think, from being really aware of the impact of Benetton and thinking of them completely away from F1, totally ignorant from F1 for me at the same time in life, and really being inspired by the marketing and advertising, I now sort of want to read a book all about it, because what they were doing with the cross color side of things, and I'm fascinated with how these stories went together. But you also have brought up the point of taking toys from boys is just never gonna survive things. And we can't talk about the lore of F1 brand stories without getting this idea that a bit of a boys club, and I am going to gender it in that, of like these guys, oh well, we'll all come in, and then if you speak to CEOs and CMOs in different industries, they all know each other, they often job hop. Here you're getting a lot more sustainability in the role, but what you're seeing is, okay, now all the cigarettes are coming, and then we have this story of Benetton, a bit of a rogue fit in it, but we see the same thing right now with the AI. I mentioned the hotels started to come in, and we see it. But there was this shift when cigarettes went, and then energy drinks came in. And with that shift was a huge audience shift that we know happened. But it's the idea that any brand could kind of come in with this momentum and get away with it. And so we cannot have a discussion around brands, sponsorships in F1, and owning the story without talking about rich energy.
Oh my God, I love this one. Also, if you are just a marketing fan or a marketer that is listening to us and not necessarily an F1 fan yet, I highly implore you to go watch the first season of Drive to Survive, this first 2 seasons of Drive to Survive, because some of the story that we're about to get into is actually playing out a bit in those early seasons. And they were the seasons, like we talked about last week, that were actually documenting and not a reality show. But here we go. In 2018, Haas, which just for a little bit of background, US team, not a lot of money, really a back of the pack team. This wasn't even a midfield team at this time. They were really trying to get from the bottom to maybe the back of the middle, and they needed money. And a very little known British energy drink called Rich Energy wanted to become their title partner. And becoming a title partner is the most expensive way to get into F1. And we talk a lot about putting your logo on something versus building a world and a whole strategy around it. They really said, I'll give you all my money, just put my name on it. And maybe that should have been the first trigger to the Haas team that this might go down real bad, but it wasn't. They literally replaced the Haas colors, red, white, and black, with the colors of Rich Energy, black and gold. So the liveries looked like this brand. It was a multi-year deal. It was supposed to add legitimacy to this underdog team. And they wanted to come in, and their whole thing was about powering and getting to the front, energy drinks, real bro culture. Before that deal, the CEO of Rich Energy, William Story, had actually tried to save the Force India team when it had gone into administration. And Force India said, you're not a viable investor. Okay, remember that. Haas was like, we'll take your money, no problem. And Story literally hoodwinked an entire sport because Rich Energy, it barely existed as a product. It had barely any distribution. There was just pallets of this drink sitting in warehouses and $770 in its bank account. $770 in its bank account. Midway through the 2019 season, Rich Energy actually lost a copyright infringement case and their logo had to be removed from the Haas. And shortly after that, Rich Story, the CEO of Rich Energy, went on Twitter and ended the partnership because of Haas's shit performance on track. So he used this story that because Haas had not made it any farther from the 10th team up, that he was not going to continue the relationship. Meanwhile, the brand was literally disintegrating in front of the world's eyes. It made no sense whatsoever. And within a year, Rich Energy was literally insolvent. And Haas, which was already a struggling team, was never paid the $35 million that Rich Energy had agreed to. And so when I think about this, I think about money isn't just money. Sponsorship is not just sponsorship. You have to, one, have a lawyer, do some due diligence. But two, you need to exist more than a brand on paper. You need to have done that strategy. You need to have done that work to understand how a partnership makes sense on both the buying end and on the brand end.
Yeah. It is interesting to see that having happened with Rich Energy. You just also know that there's no way the Haas legal team, regardless of the due diligence and all of that stuff, none of that happening. Haas most definitely doesn't have a performance bullet in their contract saying if we're the 10th team, we lose the money. They're just not that team at that point. So they wouldn't, if you get into the top 4 teams, they all have, we've talked about it in other episodes, different performance clauses for drivers and then also for the constructors that, if McLaren isn't seen on the grid, that's going to be a problem for MasterCard. It's not, but Rich Energy for sure did not have a bullet that said if we're the 10th team, you don't get it, because they were the 10th team. Like that already was. So, that's not going to happen. But controversy and F1 is obviously like most sports and things, they happen, and there are controversial brands, and you see it as it takes over the world. You go to certain areas and you will not see certain sponsors because there's gambling brands, there's crypto, there's alcohol, And we mentioned the fact that, yes, cigarettes are banned, but you definitely have the pleasure of seeing the e-cigarettes and vaping. So those same companies, again, you can't take the toys from the boys. So you have Views with McLaren for the vaping and Zyn with Ferrari. And we have the energy drinks, which continue. I do believe Max does drink Red Bull. I hear it often from people being like, the only thing he had in his hand was he asked for a Red Bull, and if people are serving him it, I actually think he drinks it. But I'm pretty sure that there is other energy drinks on the grid that have no actual energy drink in the can when you see them drinking it. I think that's a well-known, definitely not after Lando won the championship. That was not Monster Energy in there.
Unlikely.
Unlikely for sure. But, what we get here is this opportunity of how critical sponsors are to the story of F1, the building of these worlds. And we're going to touch on in a future episode also the brands of the locations here, because that plays into this heavily in terms of the investments and how the sport narration continues to grow. But it really also circles us to a white space, because it's great to hear about that Benetton era, because if I just stay in my focus group of one and say, oh, Benetton is a brand that I knew about. I knew about their marketing as a young woman growing up. I had aspiration for that brand. Failed aspiration, but I had aspiration for that brand.
It still worked, though. It still worked.
Yeah, exactly. The marketing worked. Well done. And it built up that space. And so to know that that could happen, if in the intermingling with F1, like the Sephora, that black and white monochromatic, chef's kiss, absolutely wonderful. And
yes,
we definitely, I always say when I get into the subject of, and we talk a lot about the female fandom, and I think it's really important to not gender things in a way that creates an exclusion, but understand the opportunity of the message. So we are going to gender brands a little bit because it's a wonderful white space, which is what we want to see. Imagine if we were able to tell the stories with F1 of what can happen with this rugged, masculine red, and now the energy drinks of fun and excitement and moving faster, and from the wings of the Red Bull to the Macarena wing of Ferrari. And what would happen if you actually saw a female targeted brand on an F1 car, no apologies, standard issue? Because it would bring the advent of another story to the grid that we could have told. And we got to start today with a woman driving an F1 car, which is a wonderful place. But let's talk about what we would want to see in this white space in terms of a push towards bringing that female brand conversation to the grid.
Okay, I'm going to start with a left field, maybe slightly unhinged thought. Okay. Big topic, well, especially on my For You page and everyone within my age group, is perimenopause and menopause. It's this midlife time. And there is a telehealth company called MIDI, which is all about supporting women in this mid-age time. And I would love MIDI to sponsor a midfield team and create a whole content ecosystem around supporting women in the mid and supporting people in your life that are in the mid, and taking that and telling that story both through the lens of women, but also through the lens of all of the people that support the women in their lives during this time. And for midfield teams, one of the easiest ways to move towards the front is teamwork, support, and true communication. And so that is my unhinged thought to start us off.
Well, I'm going to jump to the one. I don't want it now because I want them to wait until there's an actual female driver. But I want Bumble in a car right there when a woman makes the first move on the grid.
I love it.
Just
yes,
put it down, make it happen. Just put pressure on F1 now to make it happen, because you're going to come with the money and put Bumble on the car. I just had a pause of trying to figure out no one's yellow, but life can change. We could have a 12th team
Life
by
can
then.
change. If Haas could become gold, then surely someone can become yellow.
And for rich energy, I mean. But yeah, we do have this space. I'm going to speak a little bit more traditionally and say, bringing the realness of a Dove brand from Unilever, L'Oreal with the science. And again, we don't need to gender that brand, but because
They
Carlos
already
is the
have
spokesman,
Carlos.
they do. But that would be a push of more female skewed branding to the table. And then my left field one, because it's not Bumble, is that I really want to see always on a safety, what's around them, the foam that's around them to protect them.
I
I
literally call
think
it the I
the
won't
foam.
die foam.
Yeah, the I won't die foam. I would like to see it branded always.
Yes, 100%.
I mean, if we got feminine, we already have tampons up the noses of football players. If we could just get feminine and male protection onto the grid, it would be such a game changer of conversation. And always the brand message there is protection. I don't know if you see this in the US, but I see a lot of male incontinence adverts here in the UK. They have some
Not so
pretty
much a
hefty
US.
spokespeople. Maybe it's just a British condition.
Well, I mean, we did see Novartis launch a pretty amazing Super Bowl ad around prostate checks. So, I think we are opening a bit of a conversation around how to use interesting marketing levers and big cultural marketing moments to have some of these conversations that have been a bit, they shouldn't be taboo for men, but obviously I think most of the men in our lives, and especially American men, are not talking about getting their prostate checked. So maybe Novartis we put on the back of cars during prostate check week. That would be pretty funny as well. I think that there's a really big opportunity for finance brands. I really want to see financial literacy geared towards women on the grid. I love a B2B brand being on an F1 team because I like telling the story of how they're actually creating impact through their product. And I think the same thing can be true for finance. There's obviously a massive equity and opportunity problem within F1 for women, and women tend to be paid less. Let me redo that. My AirPod's falling out. Okay. There is a pay gap and there's an opportunity gap. And so I would love a financial brand to come in to really tell the story around financial literacy for women, and also through that kind of multi-gendered lens of how mentorship and pay and negotiation, and once you are getting the job and making the money, how do you keep it? How do you invest it? So I'm hoping for some finance, and it doesn't need to be Ellevest. Obviously, they are geared specifically towards women, but it can be Fidelity, it can be Chase. I think there's a lot of brands that have the right to win there.
And I think it's really about coming to the grid and telling that story. It's not that women don't use any of the brands. It's not like women don't use AI. It's not like we're seeing brands that they don't know, but it's conversed and held in a very archaic male conversation. And if we've watched F1 through the lore change its target market, you cannot deny 3 out of every 4 new fans are women. You need to be adjusting to that market on your car and start telling those stories. Because honestly, we do understand these are hefty bids, but they are deciding what logo is going on that car. So if you take like a company like Unilever, you look at what Google did, changing, they've gone from Google Cloud to Gemini. They pick the different products that they want to see out there, and that will always happen. So there is already investment that can start telling that story, sort of like the shift to Moxie as a hotel brand. And, all of these spaces are available to start telling a story of women empowerment and narrating it the right way, just the same way that Bernie narrates to us the engineering side in a way that is not condescending.
Exactly. And there's an opportunity for existing partners also. You have a named team, the Visa, Cash App, Red, whatever their 9,000 names are. But you already have some of these brands that have a massive opportunity to be speaking in this way to this new fan base. And they're missing it a little bit. And again, I think that goes back to the whole brand formula of this episode, which is understanding where you can grow, how, who. I'm getting rid of the P's and I'm just going into all of the other words. But, take a step back and really think about how you can utilize the investment you've already made to grow your consumer base, to grow your brand equity, your brand strategy, and eventually your actual performance.
Yeah, I was listening to the CMO of ServiceNow actually used to be a Red Bull reserve driver. Fun facts.
Had no idea.
I know. Dropping
Great
fun
fun
facts
fact
on the pod today. And he said that there were 3 things that were the reason that he was a sponsor. So obviously he's a boys and his toys guy. I mean, he's literally an ex-reserve driver. So that's a shocking, cross section anyway. But he said there's 3 things and the reason that they sponsor F1. And it's the storytelling, the hospitality, and the brand.
Love it.
And that is the future that we have ahead of us. I'm very excited for this. I want to see, I've seen some comments about on the Mercedes post about Doriane Pin today that said, what was her times? They want to know all of these different details. I've also seen a really cute comment that was this guy that said, can you tell me how to pronounce her name so that I can tell my daughter?
Aw, love that.
I think it's about looking and owning the virality of this moment as it goes through. I think she has been a really great journey woman for this. And F1 Academy, they are young. So they are primed and ready to go. And it really is time for the sponsors to jump on board and tell that story from an F1 lens. I think what Susie Wolff is up to with F1 Academy is excellent because it's a transition to next. It's I'm going to get you into other opportunities, not just stay here in this cute little cabin and stay here for many years. You can only be in F1 Academy for 2 years. Then off you go.
It's a launch pad.
And she has structured it like that so that she can have moments like this where I'm going to, after this episode, going to go read and cry for what she said because I haven't seen it yet. But hope that in our continued spring break, which we're almost at the end of, and Alyssa's actually
almost
on her way
there.
to Miami soon, so she's like counting down in her airline app.
Another plug for anyone that wants to host me and Brand Formula at Miami, call me up.
Yes, absolutely. We have a summer plans are all coming together. Do email us, brandformulapod@gmail.com, and we're available to take that. But there we are, episode 7. Well,
we did it.
On into the lore. We haven't become Marlboro men, and I'm not going to have an energy drink, but I am going to have a specialty coffee.
That is your style of energy drink, and mine.
Exactly. And I'm going to go on Vestiaire and see if there's some Benetton to wear. So
I love it.
We hope you enjoyed episode 7. And please tell your friends, please share the episode. Brand Formula is the F1 marketing podcast here every week to break down the formulas, the brands around F1, teams, drivers, back in the lore, the FIA, all of it. What they do on and off the grid. So a reminder to do all your following wherever you follow at brandformulapod and subscribe wherever you're listening to this now. We would appreciate it as we build up our channels. Thank you for listening and goodbye for now.
Lights out.